We may take our seats.
distinguished guests, and I see people still entering the room. Do come in, have a seat. A warm, warm welcome to Kenya. Karibuni, Kenya. Can we ululate for Kenya and for this first ever Africa Climate Summit? Thank you so much. Please take your seats. You are in a country, ladies and gentlemen, of incredible sights, mesmerizing wildlife, and warm, warm people. And even as we meet on this critical agenda, we hope you get some time to enjoy Kenya.
And as you enjoy our spectacular country and observe the creativity, the passion, and the immense talent of young Kenyans, we also acknowledge that we are here gathering at a time of great uncertainty. Soaring inflation, deepening polarization, widening inequalities, and the rapid advance of technology pose major challenges worldwide. In addition, there is a war raging in the heart of Europe, whose impact is felt globally. Above all looms climate change, which poses a threat to the very survival of humanity. And in Africa, the threat has been catastrophic.
It has. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to share with you the statistics, which are dire. Over 17 million people a year have been affected by storms, droughts, wildfires, floods, and landslides. More than 7 million people in Africa have been displaced by natural disasters. More than 145 million people do not have enough food to eat. Now, all this, while Africa is responsible for less than 4% of CO2 emissions from fossil fuels and industry.
As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said recently, and I quote, "The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived." It's so pertinent that this summit is being convened here in Africa to address the issues facing humanity. It was from here, particularly from the Rift Valley, that Homo sapiens set off eons ago, and several millennia later have come to dominate the planet. The progress and advances made in that period are impressive, but they have come at a price. Our ailing planet and the existential threat that we face speaks to that.
Now, allow me to highlight, ladies and gentlemen, that as home of the youngest and fastest growing population in the world, we need the voices of Africa's young women and men. The good news is that just yesterday they've been convening and it gave the Youth Declaration. And that's amazing. We must also center the realities and the needs of indigenous people and local communities. We must listen and we need to act. Now, allow me to share a Kenyanism, a wise Kenyanism. It goes, "Hiyo meeting ingekuwa email." How many Kenyans know that? See some hands. Now, I share that because we've come together, we've convened, we are meeting, we are deliberating, we've taken the time. We must ensure this translates into action for impact. Otherwise, we could just have sent an email.
And the action we are seeking here at the Africa Climate Summit is a pathway that will take Africa's realities and climate needs into account. We want a global financial architecture that helps Africa grow and the world decarbonize. We want to unlock investments Africa needs to tap into its potential and resources. This summit is about creating a new narrative for climate action in Africa, building consensus and taking a unified step forward Twende kazi.
Absolutely, let's do it. And say, just before we introduce the minister and ask her to come up, I want to settle the room and I want to rally us. Ladies and gentlemen, as you're taking your seats, can we please make a commitment that we will act following this summit, that we will collaborate, that action is critical and impact is critical? Could we give a round of applause to show our intent, our commitment, a promise to ourselves and the next generations? Thank you so much. Zain, would you introduce the minister?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you everybody here for being here and for your commitment for what we're trying to do here. It is so important for Africa today and for all future generations. So to begin, it is my privilege to introduce our Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Forestry, the Honorable Soipan Tuya.
Your Excellency, Dr. William Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya and Chairperson of the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change, His Excellency, the Deputy President of the Republic of Kenya, Honorable Rigathi Gachagua, Dr. Simon Still, the Executive Director, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Her Excellency, Dr. Monique Nzanza-Ganawa, Deputy Chairperson of the AU, Her Excellency, Ambassador Josepha Sako, AU Commissioner for Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy and Sustainable Environment, His Excellency, the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Haile Mariam Desalegn, the Right Honourable Baroness Patricia Scotland, Secretary General of the Commonwealth, colleague ministers from Africa and across the globe, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am very honored to welcome you to Nairobi, our beautiful green city in the sun. Today, I stand before you filled with pride and hope. As we begin discussions at the Africa Climate Summit, we look forward to your support towards an ambitious agenda to change the perception on the place of Africa in the global efforts to combat the climate change crisis. The journey that got us here today has been long in the making, thanks to the very visionary leadership of our heads of state and government, who took no less than 3 assembly decisions at the 32nd, 33rd, and 34th African Union Assembly sittings to make this African Climate Summit a reality. In a bold and courageous move, His Excellency, Dr. William Ruto, President of Kenya, at the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November 2022, did announce and offered to host the inaugural Africa Climate Summit here in Nairobi in his capacity as the chair of the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change. Excellencies, honorable colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, that moment is finally here with us. And I wish to express my profound gratitude to the African Union Commission as co-hosts of this summit, and especially to my sister Ambassador Josepha Sako, who together with her talented and dedicated team made sure that we were in strict adherence to the African Union instruments governing the hosting of summits. I am also very indebted to my colleague ministers of environment who have shown tremendous support and guidance and insight throughout this journey. The same goes to the African group of negotiators who have been guiding us through the process and supporting it up to where we are today. Ladies and gentlemen, our overarching goal for this summit is to chart a green growth pathway for the African continent, setting the stage for Africa to lead the globe towards a more ecologically responsible global industrialization, catalyzed by financing that is accessible, adequate, and affordable. Consequently, the summit does present to us, Africa, an opportunity to develop and present a new and bold vision for Africa as a continent with tremendous potential, abundant opportunities that can be used to solve the climate crisis. I therefore call upon all of us here to use the next 3 days to explore options as to how we can optimize Africa's abundant human and natural resources to leapfrog towards a low-carbon economy while opening new opportunities for climate finance, trade, investment, innovation, resilience, and green jobs. Excellencies, honorable colleagues, the climate change debate has entered a new era. It is no longer just about tackling an environmental or development problem, but about addressing climate change in the context of justice. We must look at African countries and their high debt distress, contextualizing it with our ability to adapt and mitigate climate change. We must look at the impact of climate change to our economies, which are heavily dependent on climate-sensitive sectors such as agriculture, tourism, fisheries, energy, and forestry, among others. We must also be cognizant of the climate change nexus with migration and the need to climate-proof our infrastructure. That is why we are persuaded that if we do not develop adequate response measures to deal with the climate change crisis, it will crush us all together. Let us therefore step up and lead the world to find solutions for climate change by listening to all voices at this climate summit, including from youth, indigenous communities, and civil society from Africa and beyond. As I conclude, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to convey goodwill and urge you all to take time during your visit and sample our rich wildlife and cultural heritage. Her Excellency, Ambassador Sako, and myself wish at this early stage to extend an invitation, since this is a ministerial, we are beginning today, to invite you all later on to dinner this evening and more deliberations so that we can firm up the outcomes that we want to see coming out of this summit. Thank you very much, and I will now take this opportunity to usher in our youth representative, Ms. Elizabeth Wathuti, who has been, for the last 3 days, have led a group of young people from across the continent to put together very solid resolutions, ideas, and very visionary indeed group of young people who are joining in the discussion and want to be part of the action. They say they no longer want to be bystanders. They want to be right on the table. Welcome, Elizabeth, and your team. Thank you so much. Distinguished delegates, invited guests, I stand on the observed protocol. After months of regional and national consultations, mobilization that accumulated into uniting youth from every nook and cranny of the continent here for the last 3 days to exchange and voice our concerns, we stand today, Saad Ukas from the Kingdom of Morocco, Dion Shukuza from the Republic of Namibia, and I, Elizabeth Wathuti, from the host country of Kenya, the land of beautiful landscapes and the greatest marathoners, as representatives of the African Youth Climate Assembly, to underscore the urgency of addressing climate change and its profound impact on Africa's youth. Our declaration, the African Youth Climate Declaration, reflects our commitment to harness the power of our youth to drive meaningful change. The African Youth Climate Assembly's vision is rooted in inclusivity, resilience, innovation, and the conviction that young people are one of the biggest resources that Africa is endowed with. We seek to elevate youth participation and inclusion in climate governance, forging pathways towards sustainable development and green growth. And we urge you, our esteemed leaders, to join hands with us in this endeavor. And we have our key asks from the Youth Declaration that I will invite my good friends from the Kingdom of Morocco and Namibia to present.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I stand on all observed protocol. The first demand that the Youth Climate Assembly came up with reads as follows. We oblige upon the key stakeholders to recognize, promote, and invest in the decision of the African Youth Climate Assembly to establish the Assembly as the principal forum for consolidating, meaningfully enhancing the coordination of youth engagement in the climate governance across member states beyond the Africa Climate Summit, and also further urge the key stakeholders to support youth inclusion in advancing Africa's sustainable development goals and the green growth agenda in continental forums. Further, engage the African Union Commission's Youth Division and Department of Sustainable Environment and Blue Economy to integrate the African Youth Climate Assembly into their structures, aligning, most importantly, with Article 19 of the African Youth Charter on Sustainable Development and Protection of the Environment. We further oblige upon parties to create an international or intergenerational green investment fund to generate green jobs for African youth. We would like to stress on this point that this was one of the most highlighted points from the consultations and also the engagements, financing youth action for climate. Further, lobby for the established United Nations Youth Office to be domiciled in Africa in line with structuring a global multilateral climate institution. We further also applaud on creating adaptation jobs for young people and equipping them with entrepreneurial skills for solutions and thus fostering resilient livelihoods. Further, engage Africa's youth as advocates for increased access to renewable energy. Engage youth in exploring Africa's agricultural potential, in particular to meet the food security challenges of the continent. And lastly, to invest in youth-led research and innovation for identifying local climate solutions. And with those few demands, I would give my brother Saad Ukas a chance to give us a closing statement. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, in conclusion, our vision encompasses green investments, renewable energy, adaptation initiatives, and youth-led innovation. Your children are watching you today. We have to trust you, and you have to trust us. We call upon you leaders to enable us and stand with us in this crucial mission. Climate justice and sustainability are within our reach, and if not, One day we will be here at your place and with our countries burning and drowning, and you will not be there to save us. If we want to go far, we have to go together, join our hands to save our continent. Ubuntu.
Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Africa is a truly diverse and multi-ethnic continent. The indigenous peoples of Africa are often on the front line of the effects of climate change. To discuss with us today the indigenous people's perspective on climate change, please put your hands together to welcome Ms. Anne Samante.
Bana ba Kenya namugezenti mulembe lundi waya mumbe kama rumwelezera ko bulayi bwo kubanenda kama tunda ko buru mu Kenya.
His Excellency the President of the Republic of Kenya, Dr. William Samoei Arap Ruto, and all other excellencies, distinguished guests, Madam CS, Honorable Soipan Tuya, all protocols observed. Good morning. My name is Samante, and I'm here to read a statement on behalf of indigenous peoples of Africa. We, the African indigenous peoples from 20 countries, gathered in the pre-summit held in Nairobi in the past 2 days in preparation for this summit today, appreciate the Africa Climate Summit Secretariat and the government of Kenya, as led by our able President, Dr. William Samoei Ruto, for the continued recognition of indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge as a contribution to African climate change discourses. The role that African indigenous peoples play in protecting critical ecosystems across the continent makes them major actors in combating climate change. Furthermore, given that our livelihoods are based on direct use of natural resources, indigenous peoples are unfortunately the most hit hardest by climate crisis, notwithstanding the fact that we have the lowest carbon footprint, or rather the lowest emitters. As the African Climate Summit commences today, our main concerns and requests are as follows. 1, on clean and renewable energy and energy transition. As we are all aware, all renewable energy initiatives are all around indigenous peoples' territories. For us, there is no idle land. For us, the so-called idle land is our fathers' grazing land. This is our area of our cultural, where we undertake our cultural rights. And so to us, any investment around renewable energy must take into consideration free, prior, and informed consent. Moreover, renewable energy investment should ensure to ease mobility of indigenous peoples, because through mobility, by ensuring mobility, then it means you've helped us to be more resilient, and the vice versa is true. On adaptation and resilience to climate risk, we are not only victims, but we also come with solutions. Our traditional knowledge and ways of life enable us to build resilience and adaptation to the impacts of climate change. Furthermore, considering that there are an estimated 50 million indigenous peoples living in 5 regions of African countries, whose participation and contribution through indigenous peoples' knowledge and knowledge system provides tremendous solution to the climate change crisis. However, as much as we contribute this much to climate resilience and adaptation, our knowledge and traditional adaptation resilience are not mainstreamed in local and regional policy and legislation frameworks. Therefore, we request this summit to recognize the contribution of indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge, which make them more resilient to climate change. On climate finance for adaptation and resilience, despite the fact that we do play a critical role in protecting the ecosystem that our lives entirely depends on, a recent study has shown that indigenous peoples receive less than 1% of all climate financing globally. Indigenous peoples of Africa continue to be obstructed from direct access to finance due to lack of recognition of our unique identity. Lack of clear policy, legal framework, and complex requirements continue to limit our direct access to climate financing, yet, as I said earlier, we are the most hit by the crisis of climate change. We therefore request for establishment of an Indigenous Peoples Climate Resilience Fund to mitigate against the impacts of climate change. On effective participation, and as climate change discourse continues to gain traction, the indigenous peoples, despite being the most vulnerable group, has continued to face systemic exclusion from decision-making, and also have negatively impacted by the climate intervention, negatively impacted by the climate intervention and response measures, some of which are detrimental to the existence of indigenous people. During this summit and beyond, we request for effective and meaningful participation of African indigenous peoples, including creation of an African Union focal point at the AU headquarters to have an indigenous person focal point who will be handling our matters at the AU. In conclusion, we reiterate again that although indigenous peoples contribute the less to carbon emissions that lead to climate change challenges, we continue to suffer the most. We are therefore here with solutions and experiential lessons from Mama Africa. We look forward to have our concerns, priority, and contribution captured in the summit's outcome document, which is the Nairobi Declaration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the summit is steeped in democracy, and with good reason, because the climate crisis affects everybody. In the last 3 days, we have had very robust engagements during the 11th Climate Change and Development in Africa Conference, held between the 1st to the 3rd of September, just ended yesterday. And this is a forum convened by the AU, UNECA, the Africa Development Bank, as well as the Kenyan government and the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, and to bring to us the voice and sentiments from the civil society is our next speaker, Dr. Mithika Mwenda. Let's put our hands together for Mithika.
Thank you, CS. Excellency, the President of the Republic of Kenya, Dr. William Samoei Ruto, the Deputy President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, respected guests, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to stand by existing protocols. It is with great honor that I address you today, first, as the Executive Director of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, representing the African civil society, and secondly, wearing the hat of the larger non-state actors steering committee for the African Climate Summit, which has been meeting since the announcement by Kenya of hosting this all-important summit in February this year. As we gather here in Nairobi for this inaugural Africa Climate Summit, I can't help but feel the weight of the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead. For many years, the climate change negotiations under the UNFCCC have remained a contestation between North and South, with deepening mistrust and a widening divide between North and South about two actions that should reverse the impacts of the challenge that poses existential threat to the survival of humanity and the planet, that is, adaptation and mitigation. The outcome of this summit, then, should seek to not only provide a neutral ground for conversation and restore hope and dignity for millions of people whose livelihoods have been turned upside down due to the ranging climate impacts manifested by shifting seasons, drying rivers, erratic rainfall, diseases, compounding food crisis, and forced solutions, but should also be responsive to African people's realities, aspirations, desires, and imperatives of climate justice. Top of these should be adaptation, underpinned by the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It is not just about coping with the impacts of climate change, but also about enhancing our solidarity in prosperity, resilience, reducing our risk, and seizing the opportunities which are coming with this challenge. Yes, Africa, with the most progressive position in international dialogue on climate change, has pronounced itself on what we require in adaptation and mitigation. And all standards show that we are doing more than our fair share in the global efforts to combat this crisis. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa needs between 160 to 340 billion US dollars by 2030 for adaptation, while the current flows are only around 16 billion annually, a fraction of a budget for a blue chip company and foundations attending this summit. We need a deep conversation on how to address this, including achieving the balanced financing between adaptation and mitigation, as delaying action now will result in exponential costs in the future. This summit should also convey a bold, unequivocal message from Africa that it is not a forum to end the industrialized countries, to escape their historical responsibilities, and transfer the burden of action to the victims of their actions, but a platform to once again renew our call to honor their commitments on deep and genuine emission reduction, adequate support to vulnerable, and support the communities at the front line of climate crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, we want to extend a hand of partnership and take front seat in the inevitable transition to low-carbon, climate-resilient, fair, equitable, and ecologically just development pathways. We should also seek to change the narratives, and I think I have heard His Excellency President speaking about that every time. And we need also reciprocal actions from our partners in the north and urge them not to shift the goalpost like they have done before. I hope, Your Excellency, you will agree with me that we are doing so much, but there is a problem. We have the critical natural resources, for instance, including vast mineral resources, cobalt, lithium, and all others, which will drive this transition. How to exploit these resources, then, should be the conversation we should have. How we leverage them will determine whether we repeat the curse of the minerals driving the carbon-addicted industrial revolution, that is through fossil fuels, which has brought us the current challenges we have. Or we will choose to start with an opportunity to shape our future through a resilient, prosperous, inclusive, and fair way. This is really our time. And thank you again, Your Excellency. When we were in South Africa during the African Parliamentarian Summit on Climate Policy and Equity, I told you, you are our general. And I told you, now below there, you have a soldier. Let us work together, and we promise our commitment to that process. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Mithika, for speaking on behalf of the civil society. Now, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we move on, noting that the vital agenda pursued this week, the ACS will play a crucial part in the global fight against climate change and have a massive impact in the upcoming global initiatives around climate action. And one of these is the COP28. And Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are aware that during this summit, we have the African Climate Week convened by the UNFCCC as part of the regional climate weeks, again, that build momentum for COP28. And we have here with us none other than the Executive Director of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Simon Stiell. Let us put our hands together to have the statements from Simon. Welcome, Simon.
Excellencies, ministers, colleagues, friends, I'm honored to be here at the Africa Climate Summit and the first of 4 regional climate weeks of 2023. I want to thank the Kenyan government and personally President Ruto for his leadership and vision in bringing us here together. And I want special recognition for Minister Soipan Tuya for her work and efforts in helping to organize both the summit and the climate weeks. This summit for Africa, by Africa, will help us tackle the climate crisis we see and feel all around the world. I speak to you today not just as the head of the UNFCCC, but as the former minister from a developing country. So let us talk about what we can do to stabilize the climate and build resilient societies in Africa and throughout the world. Development is, as it should be, a priority. I know personally the destruction that climate-related disasters can wreak on years of development. But the world is asking for a lot. Develop, but don't do it in the carbon-intensive way that we did in the past. Therefore, it is a global responsibility to collectively work out how we do that. Every day this week, we'll be putting our heads together to discuss how to build resilience to climate risks, transition to a low-emission economy, and collaborate on solutions, transforming our economies through a just transition that benefits all sectors of society. Africa, the equal partner in this endeavour, is offering its huge potential. We already know innovation in Africa is astounding. So how can we accelerate this development through green technology and energy, and in doing so, taking the necessary actions to keep in 1.5 within reach? First, we must address finance. Climate action, just like everything else in life, costs money. Finance should be viewed in the context of mitigation and adaptation, in addition to all of the other things. COP28 will be a critical moment to hold the line on temperature rise at 1.5 degrees Celsius. The world needs to reduce emissions by 43% from 2019 levels by 2030 to achieve this. And the IPCC reports the impacts will be far greater at anything above this, especially in certain parts of the world. So for starters, to hold this off, we immediately need to see the delivery of the pledged $100 billion, a doubling of adaptation finance, the substantial replenishment of the Green Climate Fund, a global finance system, both public and finance, that is aligned with action and green finance. At COP27, I committed to ensure the Secretariat does all that it can to support parties to deliver on their commitments. I see our role as catching what you, parties, throw and shine light on how you can, together, throw it higher to get it in the basket. I also committed to maximising the opportunities available to us to build collaboration throughout the year between COPs. This Africa Climate Week is a good example on delivering just that. In the past, we used to have only 3 to 4 mandated events associated with the regional climate weeks. Now there are 20. We've been working to cluster them, not just for efficient and resource saving's sake, but also because it is here, in the regions, where catalytic connections are made, and we can supercharge action on the ground. I want to see Africa Climate Week usher in climate action in 3 pivotal fronts. First, it must enable governments to amplify their contributions and commitments. Second, strengthen regional bonds and collaboration. And third, and perhaps most profoundly, empower local transformation, so that African nations can come to COP28, which is less than 100 days away, in leading action and ambition. At COP28, the first global stocktake will review our progress on climate action. We know we are not on track. Our response to those findings is a key opportunity to course correct towards a sustainable future. In addition, we must respond to those impacts we know cannot be averted through our approach to loss and damage and the operationalization of the fund and funding arrangements at COP28. The discussions taking place here will inform the global stocktake about the challenges, barriers, and opportunities for climate action and support within the context of Africa. The UNFCCC Secretariat can work with you to identify the opportunities for Africa and facilitate the solutions and to attain those opportunities. Excellencies, ministers, the world is counting on your continued collaboration and leadership. I thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Next, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, is my turn to introduce Her Excellency Josepha Sako, who is the African Union Commissioner in charge of agriculture, rural development, blue economy, and sustainable development. Welcome, my sister. You have been extremely instrumental in helping us co-host this summit.
Thank you, Cabinet Minister, to give me the floor. Good morning, every one of you. Let me acknowledge the presence of His Excellency, Dr. William Samoei Ruto, the President of the Republic of Kenya and coordinator of the Committee of Head of State and Government on Climate Change